Hello, I'm John Beattie. Welcome to Cask to Glass, the whisky podcast, where I explore the heritage and flavour of Scotland's national drink. Now, in this episode, I talked to former Scotland rugby star Chris Cusiter, who is now based in LA, importing whisky to America for Alexander Money.
All it took was one sip of the water of life.
Chris, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Before we get going, how do you take your whisky?
Hi John, I take it neat actually, that's my preference. I don't like putting ice in it because I find that it just closes it down a little bit and you lose some of the flavours. So if I'm going to sit and have one dram and really sit and appreciate it, I just take it neat at room temperature, and that's my favourite way. I've got to say that I did get into, in the COVID times when the whole world started drinking, I got into cocktails and started making paper planes were my favourite cocktail.
What's a paper plane?
Paper plane, actually probably more bourbon as the base, but then you add lemon juice and an Amaro and one other ingredient. It's like a New York cocktail bar thing. It's absolutely delicious, but very boozy. And I realized I had to pare that back, like everyone, like the whole world did after COVID. So yeah, just the odd whiskey now and again, it's fine.
When you have a whiskey, what kinds of whiskies do you drink?
My go-to would be a sherried single malt. Like that's really what I gravitate towards. Like I like all the whiskies, but if I have a choice, I really love the big kind of heavily sherried whiskies, the kind of Glendronachs or Glenfarclases or those kind of, that style is my go-to. I have a bit of a sweet tooth, and I think it's like I like that kind of desserty kind of dram. So I think I would go for a sherry dram.
And if you were, where are you, by the way? You're LA, is that right?
Yeah, I'm in LA. Yeah, I'm in a wee suburb of the giant metropolis that is Los Angeles.
You like it? Do you miss the country? Do you miss Scotland?
Of course I do. Yeah, of course I miss Scotland. I actually just got back. I was in Scotland for 3 days last week, and it was fantastic. I got the best weather for my trip. It was beautiful sunshine. It was like a beautiful spring day. I played golf down in East Lothian.
Nice.
I visited Tullybarn Distillery, and I went to Gleneagles for dinner, and I thought, okay, if I come back to Scotland for 3 days every now and again and I do this, this is perfect. But I miss it. I miss it a lot.
You weren't in East Lothian on Wednesday, were you?
I was in East Lothian on Wednesday. Yeah, I was.
We were babysitting grandkids in
How were you?
Gullen. In Gullen
I
on
was in
Wednesday.
Gullen, yeah. I was in Gullen, yeah. That's right.
No way.
Yeah,
You're Muirfield.
absolutely. No, Lough Ness.
Lough
My
Ness.
uncle plays at Lough Ness, which is a fantastic course, but it wasn't the most beautiful spring day in Scotland. It was just, I was so at peace being out down that part of the world in the sunshine. It was magnificent.
We were on the beach with the grandkids. It was fantastic. Take me back to your rugby days, because I know that what you've done is you started a whiskey shop in LA. We'll talk about, I think you got robbed. Somebody stole some very expensive stuff. Then you've got this whiskey importing business. But before we get to that, your rugby days were pretty special. I mean, I've said to you before, I think I played against your dad back in the day, and then you became this tremendous player, 70 caps and Lions outings. What do you remember of rugby now?
Oh, it was a great time to play, and it's all I knew really. Post university, I went professional right after university with the Borders back in 2003, kind of early days of professionalism, and it was my dream. When I think back, I scraped through university because I spent most of my time training, playing, just yeah. And at that age, like rugby was everything, and it was I had this dream. I want to be a professional rugby player, and I want to play for Scotland, and it's all my life was based around that. And I think when it started happening, it was like a dream come true, and it was magical, as you'll know, John. Getting to play in those stadiums for the first time in those big games, the Five Nations, Six Nations games, is just, it's the stuff that dreams are made of, and it was wonderful. I have no regrets. I think the reality of playing for that long, I played for 13 years professionally, and in an era that was just quite tough for Scotland, that you want success and you want trophies and all that, and it never really came. We had bouts of moments of success or big wins in games, but we never had a triple crown to speak of, let alone a Grand Slam or anything like that in my era. And I don't regret that. That's just the nature of it, and that was the era. But there was a lot of lows as well playing professional rugby for that long. There's lows with bad results, bad performances, injuries that offsets it. But I've been asked a few times, like I would take that trade any day of the week to have the highs of playing in those games and traveling the world and seeing the world like that with the lows that come with it. Of course I would. That's life. I think that's with the benefit of hindsight. I think you realize, that is the yin and the yang. It can't all be perfect and wins and great performances. But no, it was a great time. Loved it.
But that is the thing, isn't it? About being a rugby player, you end up sore at the end of it. We all retire. We all retire because we're either injured or they drop you, and the injuries are sore. And I've interviewed enough people to know that when they retire, it can be tough. Was it tough for you? Was it? They say it's a bit like a bereavement. How was it for you?
It's tough. It's really tough. I think when you're getting, so I was about 34 when I retired. So I'd say once you're past the age of 30, you are on the way out. You realize that, and there's young bucks coming through who are 21, who are super fit and strong and keen, and you have experience, but you're probably past your physical peak. So okay, I can keep doing this, but I need to plan something for after rugby. That's a thought that starts entering your mind for me, at least post 30. And then there's the realization that you've been living in this Peter Pan world for 13 years. So all my pals I went to school or university with by now are well established in their careers and they're doing quite well. They're working their way up. And you come out and you're just a kid, with no real world experience of anything other than playing rugby. And oh, by the way, those skills are completely useless once you leave the world of professional rugby. Nobody cares.
Yeah, because they have your passport, don't they? When you go on a trip, you give them they book the flights.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, you show up here. As long as you train and you play and you put your body on the line, we'll look after everything else, which is great. That's how it should be. But yeah, you have this sort of arrested development for all that time, and also you're spoiled, really. Like there's no other way to look at it. You're spoiled. You don't maybe realize it at the time, but you get free stuff, you get free kit, you get invited to things, you get a car, maybe, all that stuff, the little perks and benefits that come along with it, and you get used to it. And then all of a sudden, you're a nobody. You're in the real world, and it's like, right, off you go. Thanks for your time, but you're on your own now.
Yeah, we got paid nothing in our generation, and I've never said this before, but I remember being hauled into what was then the Inland Revenue Office in East Kilbride, right? And I'd earned nothing from rugby, nothing. And these two guys had me across the table, and they said, you've undeclared earnings. I said, I've never earned a penny. And they said, yeah. I said, well, you need to show me the money. And they put this list across of free kit I'd been given by a clothing company, and I had to pay tax on that. I paid tax on that as undeclared earnings.
I thought you were going to say you'd stashed all the brown envelopes under the bed.
We'll get back to that episode in a second, but the best free way you can support the podcast is just hit the thumbs up button on this video and subscribe so you get new episodes every week. It also helps lots more people find the podcast. So thank you. You left rugby. What, did you straight away buy the whiskey shop? What happened?
Yeah, I bought it before. I was at Sale Sharks my last 2 years of my career. So I went in there in 2014. And in 2015, I bought the whiskey shop over here towards the end of 2015. So I had 6 months to go in my contract with Sale. They offered me another year, but I had 3 concussions in my last season. And you know what? It was like, what's the point? I could do 1 more year, but why? And I had my sights set on coming out here. And it is funny looking back. It seems like another world. That was coming on 9 years ago now that I moved out here. But I was so keen to just leave the world of rugby and go and do something else and go and explore. So we decided to come out here, and it was hugely stressful, obviously, like finishing rugby, moving to another country, starting a new business, all in one. It was definitely the hardest thing that we've ever done. And I look back, I think, God, I don't think I would have done it had I known how hard it would be, to be honest. And in some ways that's good because you're kind of going in with that naivety of what's coming. But it was very, very hard, and I don't regret it either. But it
No.
was the hardest thing I'll ever do, I think.
But you made it work. Tell me about before you sold it. I think you sold it for a good old profit. What did they steal from the shop? What happened?
Yeah, that was early on, I think. That was probably, so I moved in 2016. I think it's probably 2017, 2018. I've still got the video actually. I cut it on the security camera. So this fella walked in to the store, and it was quite a big shop. I'd say the actual storefront was probably two to 3,000 square foot, so quite a big shop, kind of warehousey style. And there was a big set of shelves down the middle, and my office was like a little crow's nest in the back right corner. So I watched him come in the front door, and he went round the other side of the shelves, which is where the tequila section was. And I was on a call at the time, a long call, and I had a girl that was working for me that was out on a delivery, and then someone else that was in the back. So he kind of had the run of the shop to himself. And there wasn't many customers in the early days. I was trying to build a business. So I remember on the call, he would stick his head around the shelf every now and again to see what I was doing, and I was oblivious to what was going on. And it was only when I watched the tape back I realized what was happening. So he had these custom trousers on that he could fit
No,
3 bottles down each leg.
no.
They must have had definitely custom made. So he would slide bottles down, and then he could walk, and hold these bottles in his legs. So he must have had 5 bottles, 3 on one leg, 2 on the other, and then he went to the front of the store, which is where some of the expensive bottles were, and they were up behind a wee kind of plexiglass thing, but there was one at the end was reachable, so he reached up and grabbed this bottle. It was actually a bottle of cognac that I'd sort of inherited with the store, and it was a $6,000 bottle of cognac, and he took it out of the case and he chucked it down the trousers, and then he kind of wandered out the front door again, and I thought, that's strange. And then at that point, one of my members of staff came in and thought, that's strange. So they walked out the back and confronted him in the car park, and he blacked out his number plates, and he kind of drove up to them and then hesitated and then just whizzed round and then sped off. It was only after we watched the camera that we realized what had happened. And I feel a bit stupid, getting done over like that. He couldn't have timed it better, people being out on delivery. He couldn't have timed it better, but he was definitely a professional. It wasn't like opportunistic. It was targeted. And, I had to report it to the police for insurance. And, the police were like, all right, okay, so what do you expect us to do about it, kind of thing?
Can
I
we
was like,
find
well,
this man?
could you catch him? Or no.
No,
We're not going to bother with that. So it was a good lesson in security for my own shop. Yeah.
the police say we got burgled here years ago, and I ended up chasing the burglar down the naked. I ended up chasing the burglar down the road. Yeah, it was 3 a.m. It's a true story, and
Jeez, oh.
the policeman came the following day, and I half knew the guy. I think his name was Kenny MacDonald, and I said, "Look, will you catch the guy?" He said, "No." He said, "In fact, never ask who lives beside you." So, when you went into, so you had the whiskey shop, you sold that.
Yeah.
Then you've got this import business, yeah.
So I joined one.
You
Yeah,
joined one. Was it Michael Lip? Is that his name? Michael Lip.
Steve Lip.
Steve Lip. Yeah, player. And
Yeah,
how does that work? How does that work? And what do you do with them?
So Steve started this business 21 years ago, I think. So he's a guy from Turriff in the northeast of Scotland, played for Glendronach, which is how I knew him. And he'd moved out here, 22 years ago, I think, 23 years ago. And he'd worked in the whiskey business in the UK, but had come out here and wanted to try and get something going. So he ended up starting Alexander Murray and Co. as the company, and he picked up some customers and grew the business from there. So Trader Joe's are a big supermarket chain here on the West Coast. So they were the first kind of proper customer, and
So
he
you're
saw
in
the
there.
opportunity.
You're in Trader Joe's.
Yeah, so he saw the opportunity with private label, which wasn't really as established here back then as it was in the UK. So he that was his first customer and grew the business from there. So when I sold the store, that was in 2021. He asked me to come in and join him. So kind of worked alongside him, and we're now partners in the business, and I run the day-to-day operations. But I really love it. I think when I had the store, I had this dream of, this building this bridge between Scotland and California and selling Scotch and all that. But the reality of having a retail store is that you are in there day after day, year after year, and it was absolutely relentless. And I didn't go to Scotland for like 4 years and never was there. But with the import business, obviously we work with suppliers in Scotland. So I'm back there 3 times a year, and I get to have the perfect balance for me, which is visiting Scotland regularly, but living over here and selling Scotch over here, which was always the dream, was to kind of, I love Scotch whiskey and what it says about Scotland, but I quite like living here, so I wanted to sell over here. So that was a dream. And I think this business is great for that. It's the perfect business to straddle the two countries.
Who do you meet when you're there, and what do the Americans that you sell to think? What do they think when you say whiskey? What are you selling?
Oh, yeah, I mean, you get all sorts. I mean, people in the industry obviously understand the difference between Scotch whiskey and American whiskey, or bourbon or Irish whiskey, whatever. Like, people in the industry are good, but definitely a misunderstanding about, in the public, I would say, about what Scotch is. To me, it's implicit that it's from Scotland, but that's not always known. It's, they would say, "Oh, I tried a Scotch from Japan the other day." And you say, "Well, okay, that was a Japanese whiskey." So there's confusion there, and the American whiskey industry in itself can be confusing. The bourbon business is huge over here, and I ended up selling a lot more bourbon when I had the store than I did Scotch, because that run from 2015 to COVID times was huge. It was a huge boom in the bourbon industry, and that's a fascinating industry. Not completely different, connected. I mean, it's this beautiful connection in that the bourbon industry can only use their casks once. The Coopers Association have brought in this rule: they can only use the cask once, and it has to be brand new casks, which keeps them in work. Fantastic. And then, because the Scots are canny, we can buy these casks off them at a discount, ship them to Scotland, and age our whiskey. And that bourbon influence obviously has a huge impact on the flavour of the Scotch. So I think I love that connection between the two countries, and it's always been, and probably always will be, although we're in difficult times now. So I think there's different styles, different flavours, different preferences, and I think the Americans are very patriotic, I would say, and they definitely love their American whiskies, but what they think of Scotch as being this very elegant, elevated drink, quite expensive because of some of the ages that we can get to with the Scotches, but they love it. Some of the distillery names are hard to pronounce for anyone, let alone Americans, who generally pronounce things differently. So you have a decision to make in a split second: do you correct them or not? And some of them are, how do you explain a knock, for example, and say, "Oh, well, no, there's silent letters there," and the most common mispronunciation would be Glenfiddich. Glenfiddich is
Really?
That's what they believe it's
Really?
called.
I was going to ask you for some examples, because I was in Malaysia just the last couple of weeks at school reunion, and somebody said, "I've got a bottle of Lafrague to open up." And again, you don't want to correct. But we're going to do a whole program, I think, on different pronunciations. And I guess the Americans will, and it's not their fault, but they'll say Loch Lomond, or they'll say, I don't know, what other ones do they get wrong normally? If we do a program, which ones do most people get wrong?
I mean, Glenfiddich would be the most common example. Lagavulin.
Lagavulin, all the Isla ones must be impossible.
Really impossible, yeah. I mean, Glenmorangie is a difficult one for a lot of people, because a lot of people in the UK would say Glenmorangie, but I believe it's Glenmorangie. Maybe I'm wrong. What else have we got? Yeah, I think the way that Americans pronounce words is different. They put the emphasis on different syllables, so they naturally try to attribute that to the Scotch distilleries, and it doesn't work. There's a well-known road in Los Angeles called Sepulveda, but to me, I would say Sepulveda. But so it's that's the equivalent for me being an ignorant foreigner and not understanding those words. So I have a lot of sympathy, because a lot of words don't make sense in Scotland. So it's tough for us, let alone them.
Yeah, as you say, united by a common language. You kind of mentioned different or difficult times. Is it a strange little time in the whiskey world just now, do you think, when it comes to what you're doing?
It is, and I think, I've been in the business for 9 years in different aspects, but it's been this crazy bull run, let's say, for whiskey over the last 9, 10 years, and prices have kept going up and up and up. And COVID, I think, really threw a spanner in the works because for a few months at least, the distilleries were closed. So all of a sudden that throws off future projections and how much supply you're going to have. And then the whole world started drinking more than it ever had, in recent history. So it became very, very difficult to get hold of whiskey. And then now is the kind of correction, the market correction, let's say, where, perhaps people don't want to, there's a limit actually to what people are prepared to pay for a single malt Scotch. And I think that is being a bit more realistic now about the prices that were there 10 years ago were still fair. And maybe you can't just double your prices and premiumize your bottle and expect people to pay for that. There's too much competition, I think, in the whiskey space. Everyone's competing for new drinkers and younger drinkers. And if bourbon is seen as cooler and is far more affordable, then you're going to struggle to attract those customers, let alone tequila, for example, which is huge in the US and really
It's becoming
attracts all the
bigger,
young
isn't it,
people.
too, tequila? It's becoming bigger.
Yeah, it is. And for the Scotch business to, yes, you can keep going after the same consumer, but as that consumer ages out, who's going to replace them? And I think that's the key question, is trying to make it a bit younger and more accessible and not be this thing for old rich people, who are prepared to pay whatever, 100 or 10,000 for a bottle. It can't be that. I know it's not just that, but it definitely has been kind of creeping in a little bit as those, the bottles of Macallan itself are $1.5 million and, that kind of thing. It's okay, this needs to be accessible and fun and young again. And that's the challenge, I think, for the whiskey companies is what does that look like over the next 10 years?
Yeah, you could just nick a bottle from one of your stores, couldn't you? Just to...
Yeah.
I love telling the amazing story of Scotland's whiskey industry and sharing some positivity about one of the incredible things this country has given the world. Now, if you want to share some positivity too, leave us a 5-star rating wherever you are listening to the podcast. It takes you 10 seconds and will help Cask to Glass reach a much, much wider audience. When you look at the market in America coming up, do you sense some volatility or what are the Americans looking for in whiskey? Is it going to be? Do you think it's going to be a little bit more difficult now?
I think they're looking for value always. I mean, that's the world that we work in, is trying to offer value. And America in particular has a very specific system for bringing in whiskey and selling it to the public. So they have a thing called the 3-tier system. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but
I'm not.
It's very kind of heavily regulated post-prohibition rules that are in place here, which are supposed to separate the producer stroke importer from the distributor, from the retailer or the restaurant bar to the public. So it's supposed to keep all those tiers separate. So a bottle of whiskey has to pass through all of those hands before it can make it into the hands of the public. And obviously at each of those stages, there's a margin that's added. So it can make it very, very expensive. And that's the challenge in America. Plus, each state essentially has its own set of rules and regulations and laws around alcohol. So looking at the US as one country for alcohol is almost, you can't do it. It's almost better to compare it to the EU, where actually that's maybe not a good example because that's one common trading bloc, but it's 50 different countries. So there's challenges there anyway. And I think the consumer is looking for value ultimately what it comes back to. And Scotch is a well-established business. It's huge business in the US, obviously, one of the biggest export markets. And you have, what I've seen since I've been here, I think Dalmore is a good example. I love Dalmore whiskey. It's fantastic. And sometime, I think around 2016, 2017, that's when they started their premiumization process. And all of a sudden, the 12-year-old whiskey went from $35 up to $50, $55. And, and that's the strategy they took. That's great. And I think it's probably worked for them. It's fantastic whiskey, and it has almost started to rival Macallan, for that kind of luxury single malt space. But not everyone can do that. If everyone does that, paying I think above $25 here is classed as ultra premium. Okay, so as soon as your product goes above $25, it's ultra premium, and that means you're ruling out a lot of consumers. And you're talking about a product which, in general, they like the age statements here. So it's 10 years plus. You have to age your product for 10 years plus, and you can only achieve, not only, you can achieve $25 or more. That becomes really, really challenging. And your competition is a bourbon, which is aged for maybe 2 or 3 years, or tequila, which is aged for 6 months, which sells for less or the same price. That's the challenge I see for for the Scotch business is to not like price yourself out of the market here. And yeah, I think I can understand it's great to be able, if you're Macallan and you can sell your 12-year-old for $80, like you need that, and you can reinvest in all your marketing. But there's obviously a space for everyone else who doesn't need to charge that and is happy to charge $25 or $30 for a 10-year-old, and you can have that experience of luxury without paying through the nose. And I think here in America in particular at the moment, there's the kind of cost of living, not crisis, but everyone's feeling the pinch in this post-COVID world. I think it's happening in the UK as well. And if Scotch is a luxury, which it definitely is, you've got to be careful about just being unaffordable and being out of reach for a lot of people. It's not always been the case, and it doesn't have to be the case, but I've felt it going that direction since I've been here, and I think there's a bit of a reset going on just now.
Got a couple of things I want to ask you about. There was a story on the BBC this week, or maybe last week, about the kind of scam selling around whiskey barrels. I don't know if you saw it, but there is a worry, isn't there, that sometimes whiskey is being a bit too greedy, and then somebody can jump on the back of it, admittedly using a fake name, fake company, all the rest of it, and conning people out their life savings to buy barrels that don't exist. It wasn't a very good smell around whiskey, that, I don't think.
No, I think anyone in the business knew that it wasn't good and it wasn't going to end well, and it was essentially a bit of a pyramid scheme or a greater fool theory. Yes, there's value to this as long as you can find someone else to punt this onto down the line, but when the music stops and this thing has to be sold or bottled and it just doesn't make sense anymore, that was the big issue. And I think it's quite, if I think about the pitch, which is, you can invest in this this physical product and it only ever appreciates in value.
20%.
And here's some examples. Yeah, here's some examples, by the way, of casks that have sold for £1 million. It's quite a compelling sales pitch, but when it was kind of unregulated, because I don't think the Scotch Whisky Association wanted to be involved in it. They didn't see it as their remit. Therefore, it became a bit of the Wild West, and there was a lot of unscrupulous companies being set up with no experience in the industry, but opportunistic. And I think it was only ever going to end badly. And it's tragic for the people who were conned by it and who invested money, because there has to be an end user for this whiskey ultimately. It has to be put into a bottle and drunk, and the price has to make sense. And I think if you were aware of what those prices equated to, there's just no way that it was going to pay out. And I just feel terrible for the people who fell prey to those companies, and the company should be punished. I think the Scotch whisky business has always been a very honourable business, and it's quite a small business, I think, in many ways. There's only 130 odd distilleries. Most people know each other, and you have these outside parties coming in and trading off the name of Scotch whisky. That's when it just all started to go wrong. So yeah, it's tragic seeing that story. I did read some of it on the BBC this morning. It was always going to happen, and it needs to be. I think there has to be regulation in place going forward. Otherwise, it's the same thing will happen.
Charles McLean was telling us a couple of weeks ago that there is a whiskey lake. Does that resonate with you? That you're back in the old days, your butter mountains and your wine lakes. There's a bit of overproduction when it comes to whiskey.
Yes, I think there is. I think during COVID, once everything restarted, everyone started distilling, pedal to the metal. And I think when you look at the numbers, I don't think there's enough consumption to account for all that production that's taking place. And the Scotch whisky business is really interesting because you don't make it on day one and sell it on day two. Obviously, you make it on day one and you sell it in however long, 3 years up to 50 years. So it's impossible to predict the demand in the future. But I think there's been a lot of production and a lot of new distilleries coming online, and it's sort of to be determined where that whiskey is going to be sold. And obviously, I think that the blended market is the majority of the market for Scotch, and there are huge markets overseas and interesting things happening with tariffs and with taxes and different markets that could open up. So I think that it's a resilient business. It's been around for a long time and it will find a way, but it's almost like the economy in that it's cyclical, and there have been whiskey lakes in the past and distilleries get mothballed, and the economy or the market adapts, I suppose. But definitely a tough time to have a lot of whiskey right now that if your business plan was based upon it selling for a certain price. I think there's going to be some challenges because I think prices are going to come down, and it's perhaps overdue given what's happened over the past 10 years and how expensive it's gotten.
Chris, given you're in LA, if an American friend says, right, I'd like to try this Scotch of which you speak, what would you recommend? What do you give them as a here's a sample of Scotch whiskey that you're going to like this? What do you give them?
I think if you haven't drunk a lot of whiskey or Scotch whiskey, I think you have to start with something that's 40% alcohol, because it's obviously the minimum, and it's a gentler way of starting it. And it became very trendy and very cool to have cask strength and 56.5% offerings that are completely overwhelming for me even, and for a lot of people to taste first up. So I think you have to go something gentle and something more akin to a Speyside kind of flavor profile, which is lighter and fruitier and sweeter. And I think that's the most accessible way to get into it. And from there, kind of build out your palate and try to see what you like. And the Islay whiskies are phenomenal, fantastic, but quite polarizing. And I think drinking I love Lagavulin, and drinking a Lagavulin 16 in 80 degrees of sunshine in Los Angeles doesn't really make sense to me, but around a fire in Scotland, in a miserable winter's day, that sounds absolutely perfect. So there's a bit of kind of time and place as well about, what the occasion is and what the weather is and all that. I think that affects our experience of drinking whiskey. So yeah, I think a nice light Speyside, and if somebody has a sweeter palate, then a slightly sherry dram I think works for the American market, because the American palate, I think, is very sweet, and you can see that in all the food. There's lots of sugar in all the food, even in the bread they put sugar. So I think it works for the American market. But.
And do you ever sit on the beach in LA with a whiskey, or how does it work? I've got this picture of Cusiter in his rugby shorts, and maybe a couple of photographs of him playing in the olden days, and beach, the guns ready from the beach and that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, illegal to drink on the beach, so we would never have done that. But
is it illegal?
Yeah, you can. It is, yeah. On the beach in Los Angeles County, you can't drink alcohol. But I've known some people to sneak down a wee bottle and have a drink by the fire, which is also illegal. But I've known people to do it.
Yeah, people you don't
know. No, I've just seen them do it. But no, I think, to be honest, my favourite place to drink Scotch whiskey is in Scotland, in a warehouse, straight out of the cask. Like, when you have those experiences, like we did it on Islay, at Bruichladdich. I love Bruichladdich Distillery. And we did this fantastic tour, and they were literally pulling whiskey out of the cask, and you get to taste it. I mean, there's no better experience in the whiskey world than that. And Islay itself is such a magical place, and I think that's what I always want to do. I want to take my American pals over and say, let's go to Islay and go and see these amazing distilleries. That is what it makes you so proud to be Scottish, and you take people there, and then it's like a different world to over here. But absolutely fantastic. That's what I miss, about Scotland, is those kinds of places. And
it's been great talking to you. I mean, you're a great rugby player, and I'll never forget you coming to the World Cup final. You came with us with Radio Scotland, and we had do you remember the tiny wee hotel? We had almost you don't even remember. We had an Airbnb, and you were commentating with us. Yeah, I think you were expecting the big hotel, and it was just a wee pokey wee thing, but it was fun. And you've done really well, and we're all really proud you've done well. The future then for you out there is what? And what do you think the whiskey market will be for you in LA and selling around the whole of the US?
I think, yeah, I think for the time being, it's based out here. I think it's California is not in some ways not an easy place to live. In some ways, it is. It's fantastic for weather and lifestyle and all that, but it's very expensive and it's a very different culture. But I think having moved out here and been here long enough, it's probably where home is for now. But I
You've got to
definitely
drive
like
miles,
spend,
haven't you? Everything's a
you
drive.
do. You got to
Gee
drive. You
whiz.
got to drive everywhere.
Everything's a
Yeah.
drive. 6-lane
Yeah.
motorways.
It is, and it's quite isolating because of that. You can't, I've got a good Scottish pal that lives over in near Pasadena. So if we want to go for a meal or grab a drink or something, you're going to drive an hour and 20 in traffic to go for a drink. And am I going to do that? Am I going to Uber there? Like all these questions. That's what makes it such a tough place to live. It's quite isolating. But that being said, America is huge economy. There's opportunity here, and there's a very positive attitude, I think, around business, which is really refreshing. So I love that about it. But I miss Scotland. I miss the people, and I miss the sense of humor and the sarcasm and all that stuff. So I think it's this job is and this business is perfect because it allows me to spend a bit of time across the two countries. So no, I love promoting Scotch, love selling Scotch. So I think it's probably going to be a combination and. One day I might come back, but for now it's here and full steam ahead. Try and make a good life here.
Chris, thanks for that. Chris Cusiter, thank you.
Thanks, John.
We're never going home. We're never going home. Can we stay with you in Scotland for the rest of our lives?